Somewhere in a quiet government building, long after the offices have emptied and the corridors have gone still, there are rooms that most people will never enter. The lights inside are low, the doors are heavy, and they lock in ways that ordinary doors do not. Behind them, in rows of steel cabinets and climate-controlled vaults, sit thousands upon thousands of files. Some are only a page or two, others are thick with decades of memoranda, cables, photographs, and reports. Many of them are marked with words meant to keep them hidden: secret, top secret, eyes only. Tonight, we are going to spend a few slow hours in the company of those files. Not the loud, cinematic version of intelligence work, but the quieter, stranger, more human history behind it. The kind of history that unfolds gradually, in ordinary rooms and forgotten airfields, in tunnels beneath divided cities, and ships floating above the deepest parts of the ocean.
Intelligence history is unusual, and it is worth pausing to understand why. Most of the past is written more or less in the open. Wars are fought in public, elections are counted, treaties are signed in front of cameras. But the history of espionage is different. It is a history that was designed from the very beginning to remain invisible. The people who lived it were trained never to speak of it. The documents describing it were often written to be destroyed, or buried so deeply that no outsider would ever find them. Because of this, the story of the Central Intelligence Agency, usually known simply as the CIA, comes to us in pieces. Some operations became famous, argued over in newspapers and books for decades. Others stayed hidden for 30, 40, even 50 years, until a president ordered their release, or a patient historian filed the right request. Some of these operations succeeded quietly and were never needed again. Some failed so completely that they changed the course of the agency itself. A few of them changed governments in distant countries. A few produced almost nothing at all, despite enormous cost. And some of them only grew stranger with every new document that eventually reached the light.
There is a temptation, when talking about secret intelligence, to reach for drama and exaggeration. We will try to avoid that. The truth, carefully told, is remarkable enough on its own. So instead of chasing rumors, we will follow the documented record. We will move slowly through the 20th century, from the years before the agency even existed, through the tense decades of the Cold War, and into the uncertain world that followed. Along the way, we will meet the people who made this history. A general who believed America needed a new kind of secret service. Pilots who flew alone at the edge of the atmosphere. Engineers who tried to lift a sunken submarine from 3 miles down. Officers who sat across a table from men they were not sure they could trust. And the ordinary clerks, translators, and analysts whose names almost never appear in the story at all. So settle in. Let the day behind you fade. Imagine those quiet vaults, the low light, the rows of locked cabinets holding secrets that once seemed as if they would never be told. We are going to open a few of them, gently, one at a time, and follow the threads back to where they began. And the beginning, as it happens, is not with the CIA at all. It is with a war and with a man who understood that the United States had a dangerous blind spot.
To understand why the CIA was created, we have to go back to a time before it existed, to the years of the Second World War. In those years, the United States was a rising world power with a strange and serious weakness. It had industry, resources, and a vast population. What it did not have was a modern, centralized intelligence service. This may sound surprising, but it was true. In the 1930s and early 1940s, the United States gathered information through a scattered patchwork of organizations. The Army had its own intelligence branch. The Navy had another. The State Department collected diplomatic reporting. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, usually called the FBI, handled certain matters at home and in Latin America. But no single organization pulled all of this together. No one stood in a central place looking at the whole picture, warning the president of what was coming. The cost of that weakness became painfully clear on the 7th of December 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In the aftermath, one uncomfortable question kept returning. The United States had collected fragments of information that, viewed together, might have offered warning. But the fragments were scattered across different agencies, and no one had assembled them into a clear picture. It was a failure not of courage, but of organization.
Even before that attack, one man had been arguing that the country needed something better. His name was William Donovan, though almost everyone called him by his nickname, Wild Bill. Donovan was a New York lawyer and a decorated veteran of the First World War, a man of enormous energy and considerable charm. He had travelled widely, met foreign leaders, and studied how other nations, particularly Britain, ran their secret services. He believed the United States needed a single agency that could gather intelligence, analyse it, and, when necessary, carry out secret operations behind enemy lines. President Franklin Roosevelt was persuaded, at least partly. In 1941, he appointed Donovan to lead a new organization with the deliberately vague title of Coordinator of Information. It was the first peacetime, non-departmental intelligence body the country had ever created. After the United States entered the war, this effort grew into something larger and more famous, established in 1942. It was called the Office of Strategic Services, known by its initials as the OSS.
The OSS was, in many ways, the ancestor of the modern CIA. It did two very different kinds of work at once. On one side, it employed scholars, economists, and analysts who studied enemy nations and produced careful reports. On the other side, it trained agents for far more dangerous work. These agents parachuted into occupied Europe, helped organize resistance movements, gathered information behind enemy lines, and carried out acts of sabotage against the Axis powers. Some of them worked with partisan fighters in the mountains of Italy and the forests of France. Others operated in Asia. It was risky, improvised, and often chaotic, but it taught a generation of Americans the craft of secret warfare. Many people who would later shape the CIA learned their trade inside the OSS. Future directors of the agency, including Allen Dulles, Richard Helms, and William Colby, all passed through it. So did many officers who would go on to build the post-war intelligence community. In this sense, the OSS was a kind of school, and Donovan was its headmaster.
But the OSS had a short life. It was always intended to be a wartime organization, and once the war ended in 1945, its future was uncertain. Donovan wanted it to continue in peacetime, transformed into a permanent central intelligence service. He wrote a detailed plan and sent it to the president. But he had made powerful enemies. The Army and the Navy were reluctant to give up their own intelligence functions. The FBI, and especially its long-serving director, J. Edgar Hoover, viewed Donovan as a rival and wanted the OSS gone. And the new president, Harry Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death, was deeply wary of creating anything that resembled a secret police. Donovan and Truman met only briefly, and the two men did not warm to each other. Truman worried about the cost and the dangers of a permanent intelligence agency operating in the shadows.
And so, in the autumn of 1945, President Truman signed an order dissolving the Office of Strategic Services. Its functions were divided up and scattered once again. Its analysts went to the State Department. Its espionage and counterintelligence staff went to the War Department. The great experiment appeared to be over.
Yet the problem that had created the OSS did not go away. If anything, it grew more urgent. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was already cracking. A new and very different kind of struggle was beginning, one that would not be fought on open battlefields, but in quiet contests of influence, information, and secrecy. And in that kind of world, a nation without a strong central intelligence service would once again be dangerously blind. It would not take long for American leaders to realize that they had dismantled something they were about to need very badly. Chapter 2. The Agency is Born. The years just after the Second World War were a time of enormous uncertainty. The old empires of Europe were exhausted. New tensions were rising between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two great powers left standing. And in Washington, officials found themselves confronting a familiar problem. They still had no single unified way of understanding what was happening in the world.
President Truman, despite his suspicion of secret agencies, recognized this gap. In January of 1946, he took a first step. He established a body called the Central Intelligence Group, a modest organization meant to coordinate the intelligence produced by the different departments. It was placed under the direction of a small oversight authority made up of senior officials, and its first leader carried the title Director of Central Intelligence. The very first man to hold that role was a naval officer named Sidney Sowers. The Central Intelligence Group was a beginning, but it was a limited one. It had no clear legal foundation of its own, and it depended on the cooperation of departments that did not always want to cooperate. Within a couple of years, it became obvious that something more permanent and more powerful was needed.
That something arrived in the summer of 1947. On the 26th of July, President Truman signed a sweeping piece of legislation called the National Security Act. This law reorganized the entire national security structure of the United States. It merged the old War and Navy departments into what would become the Department of Defense. It created the National Security Council, a group of senior officials who would advise the President on the gravest matters of national security. And it established, for the first time in American history, a permanent peacetime intelligence agency. That agency was the Central Intelligence Agency. The relevant provisions took full effect in September of 1947, and so that year is remembered as the birth of the CIA. It is worth pausing on what the law actually said, because the wording would matter enormously in the years to come. On paper, the CIA's main job was to coordinate the nation's intelligence, to gather it, evaluate it, and share it with the officials who needed it. The Act also made the director responsible for protecting intelligence sources and methods. Much of this simply continued the ideas that Donovan and others had proposed years earlier.
But there was one phrase in the law that opened a door far wider than most people noticed at the time. The Act stated that the agency should perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence as the National Security Council might direct. Those words, other functions and duties, were vague on purpose, and within them, over time, would grow the entire world of covert action. That is, secret operations designed not merely to collect information, but to influence events abroad without any visible American hand. To understand the agency's work, it helps to separate a few ideas that are often blurred together. Intelligence collection means gathering information, whether from documents, intercepted communications, aerial photographs, or human sources.
Analysis means taking all that raw material and turning it into a clear, honest assessment of what it means. Espionage, in the narrow sense, means using human agents to obtain secrets that another government is trying to protect. Counterintelligence means protecting your own secrets and hunting for enemy spies who may have penetrated your ranks. And covert action is different from all of these. Covert action is about doing things, quietly, to shape the world, from spreading propaganda and funding friendly political groups, to supporting rebellions, to, in the darkest cases, plotting the overthrow of governments. The way this expansion happened is worth understanding because it reveals how secret power tends to grow. In the years right after the agency's founding, the National Security Council issued a series of secret directives that authorized the CIA to carry out covert operations abroad, and that spelled out how such operations should be conducted, and crucially, how they should be kept deniable. The key idea running through these directives was deniability. Covert action was defined, in essence, as activity that was planned and executed so that any American hand in it would be hidden, and so that if the operation were ever exposed, the government could plausibly deny responsibility. This principle of deniability would shape the entire culture of covert action for decades. It meant that operations were deliberately structured to leave no clear trail back to Washington, that records were sometimes minimized or destroyed, and that even senior officials could, at times, maintain a careful distance from the details of what was being done in their name. Deniability offered obvious advantages, but it carried a hidden cost. An activity designed to be deniable is also, by its nature, difficult to oversee, difficult to question, and difficult to hold accountable. The very features that protected these operations from foreign exposure also shielded them from domestic scrutiny, and that shielding would, in time, allow serious abuses to grow in the dark.
In its earliest years, the CIA was meant primarily to be a collector and analyst of information. Many of the people who created it imagined an organization of scholars and reporters, quietly assembling the truth for the president. But history rarely follows the plans written on paper. The world of the late 1940s was hardening into a global standoff, and American leaders increasingly felt that simply knowing what was happening was not enough. They wanted the ability to act. And so, almost from the beginning, the agency began to grow a second identity. Alongside the analysts came the operators. Alongside the reports came the operations. Special committees and offices were created to plan and carry out secret activities abroad, at first cautiously, and then with growing ambition. The men who ran these early efforts, including a driven officer named Frank Wisner, believed they were fighting a hidden war against Soviet expansion, a war that could not be fought openly, but had to be fought all the same.
The agency that emerged then was not one thing, but two. It was a place of quiet study, and also a place of quiet action. It was meant to illuminate the world, and it also learned to reach into it. That double nature, present from the very first years, would define the CIA for the rest of the century. And to understand how it grew, we have to look more closely at the world it was born into, the frozen, anxious world of the early Cold War. Chapter 3. The Early Cold War. By the end of the 1940s, the shape of the post-war world had become clear, and it was not comforting. Europe was divided. In the East, the Soviet Union had installed friendly communist governments across the countries its armies had occupied at the end of the war. In the West, the United States and its allies worked to rebuild democratic capitalist societies. Between the two stood a line that the British leader Winston Churchill famously described as an iron curtain stretching across the continent. This was the beginning of the long confrontation known as the Cold War.
It was called cold because the two sides never fought each other directly in open, full-scale battle. A direct war between powers that would soon both possess nuclear weapons was simply too terrible to imagine. Instead, the struggle was waged in other ways, through propaganda, through economic pressure, through support for friendly governments and movements, and through the shadow world of intelligence. For American officials, the fear was concrete and constant. They worried that the Soviet Union would expand its influence country by country, first in Europe, then in Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. They worried about communist parties gaining power through elections or through force. And behind all of this loomed the ultimate fear, that the Soviet Union might one day gain a decisive military advantage, perhaps even the ability to launch a surprise nuclear attack. In this atmosphere, the CIA's leaders came to believe that they could not simply watch events unfold. They felt they had to shape them. And so the agency's covert action work expanded quickly, especially in Europe, where the immediate contest for influence was fiercest.
One of the earliest and most significant areas of covert action was the world of information and culture. This is a part of intelligence history that is easy to overlook because it did not involve weapons or violence, but it was vast and it mattered. The idea was simple. If the Soviet Union was spreading its message through propaganda, then the United States would spread its own, quietly, through channels that did not obviously carry an American government label. The most famous example was radio. Broadcasting stations were established to send news and commentary across the Iron Curtain, into the countries of Eastern Europe and into the Soviet Union itself. Two of these, known as Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, became especially important. They broadcast in many languages, offering listeners behind the curtain an alternative to the tightly controlled news of their own governments. For years, these stations presented themselves as private ventures, supported by public donations. In reality, much of their funding came secretly from the CIA. This arrangement remained hidden until the late 1960s and early 1970s, when journalists and members of Congress revealed the connection, setting off a public debate about the proper role of secret government funding.
The cultural side of this effort reached even further. The agency quietly supported magazines, conferences, and organizations of writers and intellectuals, hoping to strengthen voices that valued freedom and to counter the appeal of communism among artists and thinkers. Much of this was channeled through a group known as the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Many of the writers and scholars involved had no idea where the money truly came from. When these arrangements were eventually exposed, they raised difficult questions that would echo for decades. Was it right for a democratic government to secretly shape the world of ideas, even in a good cause? People disagreed then, and they disagree now. It is worth understanding how this machinery of covert action was actually built, because it did not simply appear on its own. In the years just after the CIA's creation, a separate office was established to run secret political and paramilitary operations, an office that for a time operated with a striking degree of independence. It was called the Office of Policy Coordination, and its very name was a piece of deliberate vagueness, chosen to reveal nothing about what it actually did. The man who led it was Frank Wisner, an intense and driven former officer of the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, who threw himself into the work with tremendous energy. Wisner and his colleagues believed they were engaged in a hidden global struggle, a secret front in the Cold War that had to be fought aggressively if the West was to survive. They recruited officers, established networks, funneled money to friendly groups, and launched a wide range of activities across Europe and beyond. In those early years, the sums of money grew rapidly, and the ambitions grew with them. There was a sense among some of these early operators of almost unlimited possibility, a feeling that with enough boldness and enough secrecy they could shape the destiny of nations. This confidence would produce some apparent successes, but it would also lead, in time, to painful overreach, and to a slow recognition that the world was far less easily moved than they had imagined. Alongside these information campaigns, the agency was also learning harder lessons in more dangerous forms of covert action. In the early 1950s, American intelligence attempted to support resistance movements and send agents into the countries of the Soviet bloc, hoping to gather information and perhaps encourage opposition to communist rule. Many of these early efforts ended in failure and tragedy. Agents sent into hostile territory were often captured almost immediately, sometimes because the operations had been betrayed from within. These painful experiences taught the agency, slowly and at great human cost, just how difficult and unforgiving this kind of work could be.
It was in this tense and uncertain climate that the CIA carried out the operations that would first demonstrate, at least to its own leaders, what covert action might achieve. The stinging failures inside the Soviet bloc had shown the limits of the agency's reach against a powerful, closed adversary. But in other parts of the world, in countries that were smaller, more open, and more vulnerable to outside pressure, covert action seemed to offer something the agency badly wanted: the ability to change the course of events quietly and quickly. The first place where this ambition took full and dramatic form was not in Europe at all. It was in a country far to the south and east, a country rich in oil, caught between old empires and new anxieties. To follow the story there, we have to travel to Iran in the early 1950s, and to an operation whose consequences would stretch across the rest of the century. Chapter 4, Tehran, 1953. Iran in the early 1950s was a country in the middle of a great struggle over its own future, and at the heart of that struggle was oil. For decades, Iran's vast petroleum resources had been controlled largely by a British company, known at the time as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This company earned enormous profits, and many Iranians felt, with good reason, that their nation received far too small a share of the wealth taken from beneath its own soil. This resentment fueled a powerful nationalist movement. Its central figure was a proud, elderly, and passionately patriotic politician named Mohammad Mossadegh. In 1951, Mossadegh became Prime Minister of Iran, carried into office on a wave of national feeling. Soon after, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the oil industry, taking it out of British hands and placing it under Iranian control. To Mossadegh and his supporters, this was a matter of dignity and independence. To the British government, it was an intolerable loss. Britain responded with fury and pressure. It organized a boycott of Iranian oil, using its influence to keep Iranian petroleum off world markets. The Iranian economy suffered, but Mossadegh did not back down, and his popularity, at least for a time, remained strong. The British, unable to force him out by economic means, began to consider removing him through covert action. British intelligence, however, faced a serious obstacle. Mossadegh had grown suspicious of Britain and had cut diplomatic ties, expelling British personnel from the country. So Britain turned to its powerful ally, the United States. At first, American leaders were hesitant, but by the early 1950s, the Cold War lens colored everything. American officials worried that the instability in Iran might open the door to Soviet influence, or even to a communist takeover, given the presence of a well-organized Iranian Communist Party known as the Tudeh. Whether that fear was justified is something historians still debate. Mossadegh himself was not a communist, and there is reason to think his government might have kept the Tudeh at arm's length. But in the anxious atmosphere of the time, the risk seemed real enough to justify action. When a new administration took office in Washington under President Dwight Eisenhower, with the Dulles brothers in key positions, the decision was made to proceed. The operation was given the code name TP Ajax, and it is usually remembered simply as Operation Ajax. On the American side, the officer sent to help direct it on the ground was named Kermit Roosevelt, a grandson of a former American president. The plan combined several elements. It involved secret payments, propaganda, and the cultivation of Iranian allies, including military officers, religious figures, and members of the political and business classes who opposed Mossadegh. It also involved persuading the young monarch of Iran, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to play his part by formally dismissing Mossadegh and appointing a chosen general in his place.
What followed in August of 1953 was not a smooth or certain success. In fact, the first attempt collapsed. When the Shah issued a decree dismissing Mossadegh, the Prime Minister refused to step aside, and pro-Mossadegh forces took to the streets. The plot appeared to have failed. The Shah, frightened, fled the country, first to Baghdad and then to Rome. In Washington, there was a sense of disaster. According to documents released decades later, the agency actually sent a message instructing that operations against Mossadegh be discontinued, judging that the effort had failed. But the officers on the ground did not give up. In one of the more remarkable details of the story, the order to stop was, in effect, set aside. Over the following days, a second wave of activity, including organized crowds and continued pressure, turned the situation around. Pro-Shah demonstrators and military units moved against Mossadegh. The tide shifted. Mossadegh's government fell. The chosen general, Fazlullah Zahedi, took power as prime minister, and the Shah returned in triumph to reclaim his throne. It is important to be careful here, because this story is often told in oversimplified ways. It would be wrong to say that the CIA single-handedly overthrew the government of Iran, as if Iranians themselves were merely passive figures moved about by foreign hands. Iran had its own deep political divisions. Mossadegh had made real enemies at home, among the military, the clergy, the merchant class, and the palace. The economic hardship caused by the oil boycott had worn down his support. Foreign intelligence services provided money, coordination, propaganda, and encouragement, and their role was significant and real. But they worked with and through Iranian actors who had their own reasons for wanting Mossadegh gone. The overthrow was the result of both foreign intervention and domestic conflict tangled together. For a long time, the American government said nothing about its role. The operation remained officially secret for decades, but the truth gradually emerged through leaks, memoirs, and eventually declassified documents. In the year 2000, a Secretary of State publicly acknowledged that the United States had played a significant role in the overthrow and described the coup as a setback for Iran's political development. Later, in the year 2013, on the 60th anniversary, the CIA itself formally acknowledged its role for the first time, releasing portions of an internal history of the operation.
The consequences of 1953 were long and heavy. The Shah, restored to power, ruled Iran for another 26 years, becoming increasingly authoritarian. Among many Iranians, the memory of the coup and of the foreign hands behind it festered. When revolution finally swept the Shah from power in 1979, that memory helped fuel a deep and lasting anger toward the United States. The seizure of the American embassy in Tehran that same year and the hostility that followed cannot be understood without looking back to the events of 1953. As for Mohammad Mossadegh himself, the proud old nationalist who had briefly become the face of Iranian independence, his fate was quieter but no less sad. After the coup, he was arrested and put on trial. He was not executed, but he was sentenced to a period of imprisonment, and afterward he lived out the rest of his years under house arrest at his estate, largely removed from public life, until his death in the late 1960s. He remained, for many Iranians, a symbol of a road not taken, of a moment when their country had asserted control over its own resources and its own future, only to see that moment cut short.
It is also worth noting how thoroughly the true story was concealed at first. In the immediate aftermath, accounts appeared in the Western press portraying events in Iran as a spontaneous, patriotic uprising that had rescued the country from chaos and from the danger of falling under Soviet influence. Some of these accounts were quietly shaped and approved by the very people who had helped orchestrate the coup. For a general public with no access to the classified files, the real nature of what had happened remained hidden behind a comforting and misleading version of events. Only slowly, over many years, did the fuller picture emerge, and even now, certain documents remain incomplete or redacted. In the short term, Operation Ajax looked like a stunning success, proof that covert action could reshape a nation quickly and cheaply. In the long term, it planted seeds that would grow into decades of mistrust. But at the time, the lesson American officials drew was simpler and more dangerous. Covert action worked, and there was already another operation taking shape thousands of miles away in a small country in Central America. Chapter 5. Guatemala. While the events in Iran demonstrated to American officials what covert political action might accomplish, another operation was already moving forward in a very different part of the world. This time the setting was Guatemala, a small nation in Central America, and once again the story revolved around land, money, foreign business interests, and the ever-present fear of communism. Guatemala in the early 1950s was a country trying to reform itself. For much of its history, a small elite and a handful of powerful companies had controlled most of the land and wealth, while the majority of the population, many of them indigenous farmers, lived in poverty. In 1950, Guatemalans elected a reform-minded president named Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz set out to modernize the country and, above all, to change the way land was owned. He pushed through a program of land reform intended to take unused land from large holders and distribute it to poor farmers. One of the largest landholders in Guatemala was an American business called the United Fruit Company, a powerful firm that grew and exported bananas and held vast tracts of land, much of it unused. Arbenz's reforms threatened the company's holdings directly. The United Fruit Company had deep connections in Washington and mounted an intense lobbying campaign, portraying the Guatemalan government as dangerously radical and warning that communism was taking root in the region. In the climate of the time, these warnings found a receptive audience. American officials worried that Guatemala might become a foothold for Soviet influence in what they regarded as their own backyard. Arbenz did allow the small Guatemalan Communist Party to operate openly, and this deepened American suspicions. Whether Guatemala truly posed a communist threat is, again, a matter historians have examined closely, and the evidence for a serious Soviet role is thin. In fact, a later CIA effort to comb through captured documents for proof of Soviet control turned up essentially nothing. But at the time, the perception of danger was enough. The operation to remove Arbenz was authorized by President Eisenhower and given the codename PB Success. It had a predecessor, an earlier plan under President Truman that had been called off, but this new effort was more determined. The plan did not rely on a large invading army. Instead, it depended heavily on deception and psychological pressure.
The CIA armed and trained a modest force of a few hundred fighters, led by an exiled Guatemalan officer named Carlos Castillo Armas. This force was small, far too small to conquer the country by strength alone. Its real purpose was to create the impression of an unstoppable uprising.
The heart of the operation was psychological warfare. The agency set up clandestine radio stations, broadcasting into Guatemala under names suggesting they were the voice of a popular rebellion. These broadcasts spread rumors, announced imaginary troop movements, and created a sense that a powerful force was closing in on the capital. The goal was to frighten Arbenz's supporters and, above all, to convince the Guatemalan army that resistance was hopeless. Alongside the broadcasts came other pressures, including threatening messages, leaflets, and a general atmosphere of impending doom. In June of 1954, Castillo Armas led his small force across the border, while aircraft flown in support of the operation carried out bombing runs over Guatemala City. Militarily, the invasion was almost trivial, but psychologically it worked. The Guatemalan army, uncertain and unwilling to fight for Arbenz, hesitated. Arbenz, believing the military would not stand behind him, concluded that his position was untenable. On the 27th of June 1954, he resigned. After negotiations, Carlos Castillo Armas became the new leader of Guatemala. To the Eisenhower administration, PB's success looked like another triumph, an even cleaner demonstration of what covert action could do. A hostile government had been removed at modest cost, without a visible American army and without a wider war. The operation seemed to confirm the lesson of Iran. Encouraged, American leaders came to see this model, the small force, the psychological pressure, the encouragement of a local uprising, as a reliable tool.
But the aftermath told a darker story. According to the agency's own later historical account, the planners had given remarkably little thought to what would happen after Arbenz fell. Castillo Armas established an authoritarian government, reversed the land reforms, and cracked down on his opponents. He was assassinated a few years later, and Guatemala descended into cycles of instability. Over the following decades, the country endured a long and brutal civil war marked by terrible violence, in which hundreds of thousands of people would eventually suffer. The quick and clever operation of 1954 cast a very long shadow. And there is one more consequence worth noting, because it connects directly to a later chapter of this story. The apparent success of the Guatemala model gave the CIA a dangerous confidence. The idea that a small force of exiles, backed by propaganda and covert support, could topple a government and inspire a popular uprising became fixed in the agency's thinking. Years later, that same idea would be carried to an island in the Caribbean, where it would collide with reality and produce one of the most famous failures in the agency's history. But before we reach that island, we must turn to a very different kind of operation, one that took place not in the sunlight of Central America, but underground, beneath one of the most divided and dangerous cities on Earth. Chapter 6. Beneath Berlin. While officers in Iran and Guatemala worked through human networks and psychological pressure, another kind of intelligence work was developing in the ruined and divided city of Berlin. This work was quieter, more technical, and in some ways more remarkable, because it involved literally tunneling beneath the front line of the Cold War to listen to the enemy's secrets. To understand it, you have to picture Berlin as it was in the 1950s. The old German capital lay deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, and yet the city itself was divided among the wartime allies. The Soviets held the eastern part. The Americans, British, and French held the western part. This made Berlin a strange island, a place where the two sides of the Cold War pressed directly against each other, street by street. It was, above all, a city of spies. Every intelligence service in the world seemed to have people there, watching, listening, and recruiting. For American and British intelligence, Berlin offered a rare opportunity. Beneath the streets of the Soviet-controlled sector ran telephone and telegraph cables that carried communications for the Soviet military and its intelligence services. If those cables could be tapped, the West might gain a direct window into Soviet thinking, hearing their conversations and reading their messages in real time.
There was a precedent for this idea. British intelligence had already carried out a similar operation in the city of Vienna in Austria, tapping Soviet communication lines through a tunnel. That earlier effort, sometimes remembered under the name Operation Silver, had shown that the concept could work. Now the question was whether it could be repeated in Berlin on a much larger and more ambitious scale. The plan that emerged was a joint effort between the American CIA and the British Secret Intelligence Service, often known as MI6. On the American side, the driving figure was a colourful and determined officer named William Harvey. The operation was codenamed Gold by the Americans and Stopwatch by the British. The idea was to dig a tunnel from the western sector under the border to a point beneath the eastern sector where the target cables ran, and there to install taps that would carry Soviet communications back to a listening post.
The engineering challenge was immense. The tunnel had to be dug in secret, without the enormous quantities of excavated soil giving the game away. To hide the work, the Americans constructed a building on the western side that looked like an ordinary military warehouse and radar station, giving a plausible reason for trucks and equipment to come and go. Beneath it, the tunnel slowly took shape. It stretched roughly 1,476 feet and stood about 6 feet in diameter. Workers removed thousands of tons of soil and lined the passage with steel. They even devised ways to manage the heat and moisture and to guard against a cave-in. Everything had to be done with extraordinary care, because the far end of the tunnel would reach beneath territory controlled by the very people it was meant to spy upon. The tunnel was approved at the highest levels, and construction moved forward through 1954. British technicians installed the delicate equipment needed to tap the cables, and in May of 1955 the operation began to collect. For nearly a year, the taps carried a river of Soviet and East German communications back to Western analysts, who recorded and studied tens of thousands of conversations, sifting them for anything of value about Soviet forces, plans, and intentions.
But here, the story takes a turn that makes it one of the strangest episodes of the Cold War. Because unknown to the Americans and the British who dug the tunnel, the Soviets had known about the entire project almost from the beginning. The reason was a man named George Blake. Blake was an officer of British intelligence, but he was also secretly working for the Soviet Union, having been recruited during an earlier period when he was held captive during the Korean War. Blake had access to the planning of the Berlin Tunnel. In fact, he attended meetings about it and took notes, and he passed what he knew to his Soviet handlers before the digging was even complete. This placed the Soviets in a delicate position. They knew about the tunnel, but if they moved to shut it down too obviously, they risked exposing Blake as the source of their knowledge. Blake was a valuable agent, and protecting him mattered more to them than protecting the information flowing through the cables. So they made a cold calculation. They allowed the tunnel to keep operating, choosing to sacrifice some of their secrets rather than reveal that they had a spy inside British intelligence.
There is a subtle and much debated question here. If the Soviets knew the West was listening, did they feed false information down the tapped lines to deceive their enemies? Interestingly, according to the CIA's own assessment,
there is little sign that they did so in any systematic way. To protect Blake, the Soviets kept the circle of knowledge extremely tight. They did not warn the ordinary Soviet military users of the cables, nor the East German authorities that their lines were compromised. As a result, much of the traffic that flowed through the tunnel appears to have been genuine. In trying to protect their spy, the Soviets allowed real secrets to keep leaking out. The tunnel's operation came to an end in April of 1956, after roughly 11 months. The Soviets staged what they presented as an accidental discovery, claiming that heavy rain and a faulty cable had led their repair crews to stumble upon the tap. They hoped to score a propaganda victory by exposing the operation as a scandalous Western intrusion, but their plan backfired. When the story broke, much of the Western press reacted not with outrage, but with something close to admiration, marveling at the sheer audacity and technical skill involved in tunneling beneath the enemy's feet.
As for George Blake, his betrayal was uncovered a few years later, and he was tried and sentenced to a long prison term. But in one final twist, he escaped from prison and made his way to the Soviet Union, where he lived out his life. The Berlin Tunnel remains a perfect illustration of how tangled and layered Cold War intelligence could be. A brilliant operation, betrayed from the start, allowed to run by an enemy protecting a deeper secret, producing genuine intelligence all the while, and ending in a discovery that embarrassed the very side that revealed it. While intelligence officers were burrowing beneath Berlin to listen through wires, another group of planners within the agency was thinking about a completely different way to see into the closed world of the Soviet Union. They were not looking underground at all, they were looking up. Chapter 7. Eyes Above the Soviet Union. One of the deepest problems facing American intelligence in the 1950s was also one of the simplest to state. The United States did not know what was inside the Soviet Union. The Soviet state was enormous, secretive, and closed. Its interior was largely hidden from outside eyes. American leaders did not have reliable information about how many bombers the Soviets had built, where their missiles were located, or how quickly their military was growing.
This ignorance was dangerous. In the absence of hard facts, fear filled the gap. American politicians spoke anxiously of a bomber gap and later a missile gap, warning that the Soviet Union might be racing ahead in the production of long-range weapons. Without accurate information, it was impossible to know whether these fears were justified or wildly exaggerated. And in the nuclear age, guessing wrong in either direction could be catastrophic. President Eisenhower understood this problem acutely. He wanted facts, not fears. And so he supported a bold and secret effort to see inside the Soviet Union from above. The result was one of the most remarkable aircraft ever built, a strange, glider-like plane designed to fly higher than anything else in the sky. It was called the U-2. The U-2 was created by a legendary team of engineers at an aircraft company, working in a secretive design unit often nicknamed the Skunk Works, led by the brilliant designer Kelly Johnson. The challenge was extraordinary. The plane needed to fly at altitudes above 70,000 feet, more than 13 miles up, far higher than ordinary aircraft. At that height, it would be, at least for a time, beyond the reach of Soviet fighter planes and anti-aircraft missiles. And it would carry cameras of astonishing precision, capable of photographing objects on the ground in remarkable detail from the edge of the atmosphere. Flying the U-2 was a lonely and demanding job. The pilot sat in a pressurized suit, alone at the top of the world, in a machine that was notoriously difficult to handle. The plane was so specialized that flying it safely required great skill. The pilots who flew these missions were, in effect, spies in the sky, crossing into hostile airspace with nothing but altitude to protect them. Consider for a moment what such a flight actually asked of a person. Long before dawn, the pilot would begin breathing pure oxygen for hours, a necessary preparation for the extreme altitude to come. Then he would be sealed into a cumbersome pressure suit, helped into the narrow cockpit, and sent aloft into the thin air at the edge of space, where the sky above turns dark even in daytime, and the curve of the earth becomes visible below. For hours he would fly alone across hostile territory, holding the fragile aircraft within a narrow band of safe speed, knowing that a small mistake could send the plane into an uncontrollable dive, and knowing too that far below an entire nation would very much like to bring him down. There was no companion to share the burden, no way to relax, only the steady, exhausting concentration of a single person carrying out a dangerous task in absolute solitude. These were quiet acts of courage, performed in secret, that the public would not learn of for a long time.
Beginning in the mid-1950s, U-2 flights began crossing over the Soviet Union, photographing airfields, factories, missile sites, and military installations. The intelligence they gathered was priceless. For the first time, American analysts could see with their own eyes what the Soviet Union actually possessed. And what they saw was reassuring in one crucial respect. The feared gaps, the idea that the Soviets had raced far ahead in bombers or missiles, turned out to be greatly exaggerated. The photographs showed a Soviet military that was formidable but not overwhelming. In this sense, the U-2 did something quietly profound. It replaced fear with knowledge and helped prevent the United States from overreacting to threats that did not exist. The Soviets, for their part, were not blind. They could often detect the U-2 flights on radar as the planes passed high overhead. It was deeply humiliating for them to know that American aircraft were photographing their territory at will and that they could do nothing to stop it. For several years, the U-2 flew above the reach of Soviet defenses, but the Soviets were working hard to close that gap, developing new surface-to-air missiles with greater range and higher ceilings. It was only a matter of time before the sanctuary of high altitude was breached. That moment came on the 1st of May, 1960. A U-2, piloted by an experienced CIA pilot named Francis Gary Powers, took off from a base in Pakistan on a mission that was to cross deep into the Soviet Union and land in Norway. But over the Soviet interior, near the city of Sverdlovsk, a Soviet surface-to-air missile detonated close enough to bring the aircraft down. Powers survived, parachuting to the ground, where he was quickly captured. What happened next was a diplomatic disaster for the United States. American officials, assuming the pilot had died and the aircraft had been destroyed, put out a cover story. They claimed that a weather research plane had gone missing after its pilot reported trouble with his oxygen supply near the Turkish border. It seemed a safe enough lie. But the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, sprang a trap. He announced that a plane had been shot down and let the Americans commit fully to their weather plane story. Then he revealed that the pilot was alive, in Soviet custody, and talking, and that much of the aircraft, including its cameras, had been recovered. The American cover story collapsed in humiliating fashion, and President Eisenhower was left to acknowledge the truth of the overflights. The timing could hardly have been worse. A major summit meeting between Eisenhower and Khrushchev was about to take place in Paris. The two leaders had been on reasonably good terms, and there had been hope for progress in easing Cold War tensions. But the U-2 affair poisoned the atmosphere. Khrushchev arrived in Paris furious, demanded an apology, and when he did not receive one to his satisfaction, walked out. The summit collapsed. A rare opening towards reduced tension had been slammed shut.
Francis Gary Powers was put on trial in Moscow, convicted of espionage and sentenced to a term in prison. But he did not serve it all. In 1962, he was exchanged for a captured Soviet intelligence officer named Rudolf Abel in a carefully arranged swap that took place on a bridge connecting West Berlin to the east. It was the first exchange of its kind between the two superpowers, a quiet ritual of the Cold War that would be repeated in various forms over the years. The U-2 incident marked the end of an era. Manned flights over the heart of the Soviet Union were now far too dangerous. But American intelligence had already been preparing something that would make such risky flights unnecessary. The future of reconnaissance lay not in aircraft crossing hostile borders, but in machines orbiting far above them, in space, where no missile could reach and no sovereignty was violated.
That future was a secret satellite program developed jointly by the CIA and the Air Force, known by the codename Corona. For years, it operated under the cover of a scientific research effort. The early attempts were plagued by failure after failure, as rocket after rocket malfunctioned or the film capsules were lost. But eventually, the engineers succeeded. Beginning around 1960, Corona satellites began returning film of the Soviet Union, dropping capsules of exposed film that were snatched from the air as they parachuted back to Earth. From orbit, and without risking a single pilot, the United States could now photograph vast stretches of Soviet territory. The age of satellite reconnaissance had arrived, quietly and in secret, and it would transform intelligence forever. But the existence of the Corona program itself would remain hidden from the public for decades, not acknowledged until the 1990s. While the agency was learning to see the Soviet Union from the sky, it was about to stumble into one of its greatest failures much closer to home, on a small island just off the coast of Florida. Chapter 8. Cuba.
At the very start of 1959, a revolution came to the island of Cuba, only about 90 miles from the coast of the United States. A young revolutionary named Fidel Castro led a guerrilla movement that overthrew the country's American-backed ruler, Fulgencio Batista, and marched into the capital, Havana. At first, it was not entirely clear what kind of government Castro would build, but over the following months it became increasingly evident that his revolution was turning in a radical direction, nationalizing American-owned businesses, drawing closer to the Soviet Union, and positioning itself firmly against the United States. For American leaders, the idea of a hostile, Soviet-aligned government so close to their own shores was deeply alarming. They watched with growing anxiety as Cuba's relationship with Moscow deepened, and they began to search for a way to remove Castro from power. Given the recent apparent successes in Iran and especially in Guatemala, the CIA turned to a familiar model. Perhaps a force of Cuban exiles, trained and armed in secret, could return to the island, spark a popular uprising, and topple the new government, just as a small force had seemed to do in Guatemala a few years earlier.
Planning for such an operation began under President Eisenhower in the last year of his time in office. The CIA started recruiting and training Cuban exiles, many of them living in Florida, who were bitterly opposed to Castro. This force came to be known as Brigade 2506. The plan called for them to land in Cuba, establish a foothold, and rally the Cuban people against Castro, with the expectation that the population would rise up in support. When John Kennedy became president in early 1961, he inherited this plan, already well advanced. Kennedy had doubts, and he worried above all about making American involvement too obvious. He did not want the operation to look like a direct American invasion, fearing the international consequences and the risk of provoking the Soviet Union.
so he insisted on changes to reduce the visible American hand. Among other decisions, the landing site was moved to a more remote location on the southern coast of Cuba, a place called the Bay of Pigs.
Unfortunately, the changes meant to make the operation more deniable also made it more likely to fail. The Bay of Pigs was remote, but it was surrounded by swamps and difficult terrain, and it lay far from the mountains where the exiles might have retreated to fight a guerrilla campaign if things went wrong. The whole plan rested on a series of hopeful assumptions. It assumed that the initial airstrikes would destroy Castro's air force. It assumed that the Cuban people would rise up. And it assumed, at least among some of the planners and exiles, that if the operation faltered, the United States would step in with its own military might to rescue it. Every one of these assumptions proved wrong. The operation began in mid-April of 1961 with an airstrike. Old bombers, painted to look like Cuban aircraft, attacked Cuban airfields, hoping to destroy Castro's planes on the ground. But the strike was only partly effective, leaving much of the Cuban Air Force intact. Worse, the disguise quickly fell apart. Photographs of the aircraft revealed that they were not really Cuban, exposing the American hand behind the attack. Embarrassed and worried about the growing evidence of United States involvement, President Kennedy cancelled a planned follow-up airstrike. This decision left the exile force dangerously exposed, without the air cover that the plan had assumed.
On the 17th of April, 1961, roughly 1,400 members of Brigade 2506 landed at the Bay of Pigs. Almost immediately, things went badly. Castro had learned of the plan and had moved quickly, sending a large force to the area. The exiles, outnumbered and lacking air support, found themselves pinned on the beaches. The hoped-for popular uprising did not materialize. In fact, the local population, many of whom had benefited from Castro's early reforms, did not rally to the invaders. Within a matter of days, the brigade was overwhelmed. More than 100 of the exiles were killed and well over 1,000 were captured. The survivors were held prisoner in Cuba for many months until they were eventually released in exchange for food and medical supplies after long negotiations. The Bay of Pigs was a catastrophe on almost every level. It failed to remove Castro. It strengthened him, allowing him to present himself as the heroic defender of Cuba against foreign aggression, and pushing him even closer to the Soviet Union. It humiliated the United States on the world stage, and it deeply embarrassed the new administration. Within the agency, the operation came to be remembered as a kind of perfect failure, a disaster that combined flawed assumptions, wishful thinking, and operational missteps.
President Kennedy was furious, and he took the failure hard. He is said to have wondered aloud how he could have been so foolish as to let the plan proceed. In the aftermath, several senior figures at the CIA departed, and the episode led to soul-searching about how such a badly conceived operation had gained so much momentum. One lasting effect was a lesson about the dangers of a self-contained plan gathering unstoppable force, with each participant assuming that someone else would ensure success. But the failure at the Bay of Pigs did not end American efforts against Castro. If anything, it intensified them, at least for a time. In the period that followed, the administration launched a broad and secret campaign aimed at undermining and destabilizing the Cuban government. This effort, known as Operation Mongoose, involved a wide range of activities, from propaganda and economic sabotage to plans for disrupting the Cuban economy. It was overseen with intense interest from the highest levels of the administration.
Among the more disturbing threads that would later come to light were schemes to assassinate Castro himself. Years afterward, congressional investigators would document a series of plots,
some of them almost absurd in their inventiveness, involving poisons and other methods, and even, in some cases, contacts with organized crime figures who were thought to have the means and the motive to reach the Cuban leader. None of these plots succeeded. Castro survived, outliving the many efforts against him by decades. But the mere fact that such schemes had been contemplated, and in some cases attempted, would become a source of profound controversy when it was finally revealed.
Operation Mongoose was, in its way, a revealing episode. It showed how a great power, stung by a humiliating defeat, could pour enormous energy and imagination into a campaign against a single small country and a single defiant leader. The effort involved a large number of officers and a substantial budget, and it generated a steady stream of plans and schemes, many of which came to nothing. Sabotage of Cuban infrastructure, disruption of the sugar harvest that was so vital to the Cuban economy, propaganda, and support for internal opposition, all of these were pursued. Yet Castro's hold on power only tightened, and the campaign produced far more frustration than result. In hindsight, it stands as an example of how the desire to reverse a failure can lead to obsessive and often counterproductive efforts, consuming resources and attention, while the underlying situation remains stubbornly unchanged. The obsession with Cuba also played a part in the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War. In 1962, the discovery, thanks in large part to aerial reconnaissance, that the Soviet Union was placing nuclear missiles in Cuba triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis, a terrifying standoff that brought the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been. That crisis is a vast story in its own right, but it is worth noting how closely it was bound up with the long, tangled, and often secret struggle between the United States and Castro's Cuba. Cuba, then, marked a turning point. It exposed the limits of the covert action model that had seemed so successful in Iran and Guatemala. It showed that the same approach, applied to a determined adversary with real popular support, could fail spectacularly. And even as the agency absorbed these hard lessons in the Caribbean, it was becoming deeply involved in secret conflicts on the far side of the world, in the mountains and jungles of Asia. Chapter 9. The Secret War in Southeast Asia. Far from the beaches of Cuba, in the high mountains of Central Asia and the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, the CIA was drawn into a series of secret conflicts that would test its capacity for paramilitary action, the direct support of armed fighters, on a scale far beyond anything it had attempted before. These were not quick operations meant to topple a government in a matter of weeks. They were long, grinding, and largely hidden wars. One of the earliest of these involved the remote and mountainous land of Tibet. In the 1950s, Tibet came under the control of the People's Republic of China, and a resistance movement arose among Tibetans opposed to Chinese rule. Beginning in the late 1950s, the CIA became involved in supporting elements of this resistance. Tibetan fighters were secretly brought out of the region and trained at a facility in the mountains of Colorado, in the United States, where the high-altitude terrain resembled their homeland. They were then returned, and supplies and weapons were dropped to resistance forces by air. The Tibetan operation was always a difficult and, in the end, a losing effort. The geography was forbidding, the distances enormous, and the balance of power overwhelmingly against the resistance. The spiritual and political leader of Tibet, the Dalai Lama, fled into exile in 1959. Over the following years, the resistance was gradually worn down, and as the broader diplomatic picture shifted, particularly as the United States began in the early 1970s to seek better relations with China, support for the Tibetan operation faded and was eventually ended. For the Tibetans who had fought and hoped, it was a bitter conclusion. The episode remains a poignant example of how the grand strategies of distant powers could raise and then abandon the hopes of a small people caught in the middle. Far larger and far more consequential was the secret war in Laos. Laos was a small landlocked country in Southeast Asia, neighbor to Vietnam, where the United States was becoming ever more deeply involved in a long and painful war. Laos was officially neutral, but in practice it became a crucial battleground because vital supply routes for communist forces ran through its territory. The United States could not openly send its army into a country that was supposed to be neutral, so instead much of the American effort in Laos was conducted secretly through the CIA. This became the largest paramilitary operation in the agency's history up to that time. The CIA organized, armed, trained and directed a secret army drawn largely from the Hmong people, an ethnic group living in the mountains of Laos. Their most prominent leader was a Hmong military commander named Vang Pao. For years, these forces fought against communist units and their North Vietnamese allies in a conflict that most Americans knew nothing about. It was, quite literally, a secret war, waged in the shadows of the much larger and more visible war in Vietnam. Supporting this hidden conflict required an enormous logistical effort, and much of it depended on air power of an unusual kind. The agency made use of an airline that appeared, on the surface, to be an ordinary commercial cargo operation. It was called Air America. In reality, Air America was closely tied to the CIA, and its pilots flew supplies, weapons and personnel into remote airstrips carved out of jungle clearings and mountainsides, often in dangerous conditions. These pilots delivered rice and ammunition to isolated outposts, evacuated the wounded, and carried out missions in some of the most difficult flying environments on Earth. For years, Air America was one of the least visible but most essential parts of the secret war. The pilots of Air America flew in some of the most punishing conditions imaginable. They landed on tiny, primitive airstrips perched on ridges and hacked out of the forest, often shrouded in mist, sometimes under fire. They flew aging aircraft heavy with cargo, threading through mountain valleys where the weather could turn deadly in minutes. Many of them were skilled, adventurous, and fiercely proud of their work, even as they operated in a war their own country would not officially admit to fighting. Some did not come home. Their losses, like so much of this hidden conflict, went largely unremarked, absorbed into the silence that surrounded the entire operation. The secret war in Laos dragged on for more than a decade, closely linked to the wider conflict in Vietnam. When American involvement in Southeast Asia finally collapsed in the mid-1970s, the consequences for those who had fought alongside the United States were often tragic. Many of the Hmong who had served in the secret army faced terrible danger once the fighting ended and their side had lost. Large numbers fled as refugees, and many eventually resettled far away, including in the United States. The war they had fought had been secret, and for a long time their sacrifices were little known to the American public. These Asian operations reveal a different face of the agency from the political coups of Iran and Guatemala. Here the CIA was not merely nudging events through propaganda and covert payments. It was raising armies, running airlines, and directing sustained military campaigns, all while the involvement of the United States remained officially hidden or denied. It was intelligence work shading into full-scale, if secret, warfare. They also raise hard questions that would echo through later decades. What responsibility does a powerful nation bear toward the local people it recruits into its secret wars? What happens to those fighters and their families when the strategy changes and the support is withdrawn? These questions have no easy answers, and the history of the secret wars in Asia offers no comfortable conclusions. What it offers instead is a sober reminder that behind the maps and the strategy sat real people in remote villages and mountain valleys whose lives were bound up in decisions made far away. While the agency was fighting these secret wars abroad, it was also back home pursuing some of its strangest and most troubling activities. These took place not on battlefields, but in laboratories, hospitals, and safe houses, in a search to understand and control the human mind. Chapter 10. Experiments in the Shadows. Of all the activities in the history of the CIA, few have become as notorious or as heavily wrapped in myth as the program known as MK-Ultra. It is a subject that requires special care because the popular imagination has attached to it an enormous amount of speculation, rumor, and outright fantasy. The documented reality is disturbing enough on its own, and we will do our best to stay close to what the records actually show and to be honest about what remains uncertain.
To understand why such a program existed at all, we have to return to the fearful atmosphere of the early Cold War. In those years, American intelligence officials became deeply anxious about the possibility that hostile powers might have discovered ways to control the human mind. There were reports and worries about brainwashing, about prisoners who seemed to have been psychologically manipulated, about the possibility that drugs or other techniques could be used to extract information, to alter behavior, or to compromise a person's loyalty. Whether these fears were realistic is another matter, but the fear was real, and it drove the agency to explore whether such things were possible, and if so, whether the United States could master them first.
MK-Ultra did not spring up out of nowhere. It grew out of earlier research efforts with their own code names, programs that had already begun exploring the same dark questions in the years just before. These predecessors had experimented with interrogation methods, with drugs, and with the possibility of influencing or breaking down a person's will. MK-Ultra gathered up and expanded these lines of inquiry, giving them a single umbrella and a large, flexible budget. The continuity matters because it shows that the impulse behind the program was not a sudden aberration, but the product of a sustained anxiety, one that had been building through the early years of the Cold War, about what the other side might be capable of, and about whether the human mind itself could become a battleground. Out of these concerns came a series of research programs. The most famous of them, MK-Ultra, was formally authorized in 1953, under the leadership of the agency's director at the time, Alan Dulles. It was placed within a technical branch of the agency, and for most of its existence it was directed by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb became the central figure of the program, the man who signed off on many of its projects and oversaw its work. MK-Ultra was not a single experiment, but an umbrella covering a large number of separate research projects, often called sub-projects, each assigned its own number. Over the years, there were roughly 150 of these sub-projects, and they reached into dozens of universities, hospitals, prisons, and other institutions across the country. Much of this research was contracted out to scientists and doctors, some of whom knew who was ultimately funding their work, and some of whom did not. The methods explored under MK-Ultra were wide-ranging, and some of them were deeply unethical by any reasonable standard. The most infamous involved the drug LSD, a powerful hallucinogen. Researchers wanted to understand its effects and whether it might be used in interrogation or to manipulate behavior. In some cases, the drug was given to volunteers who knew what was happening. But in other cases, and this is one of the darkest aspects of the program, it was administered to people without their knowledge or consent.
One especially troubling operation involved safe houses, ordinary-looking apartments set up in cities including San Francisco and New York, where unwitting individuals were secretly given drugs so that their reactions could be observed. This effort was run with the involvement of a federal narcotics agent, and the subjects, often people on the margins of society, had no idea they were being used in a government experiment. The ethical violations here are severe and undeniable. People were drugged without their consent, their basic rights and dignity disregarded in the name of research. The program also had a dark connection to at least one death. In 1953, a scientist named Frank Olson, who worked for the army but was connected to this world of secret research, was given LSD without his knowledge at a gathering. In the days that followed, he suffered a severe psychological crisis, and he died after falling from a hotel window in New York. For many years, his death was described as a suicide, though his family and others have long disputed the full circumstances, and questions about exactly what happened have never been entirely settled. Whatever the precise truth, the Olson case became a haunting symbol of the human cost of these experiments.
There was also an international dimension. Some research connected to this world took place outside the United States, including disturbing psychiatric experiments at an institution in Canada, where patients undergoing treatment were subjected to extreme and damaging methods. The suffering caused in these cases was real and lasting. Now we come to one of the most important and frustrating facts about MKUltra, the reason it remains so shrouded in uncertainty. In 1973, as the political climate in Washington was shifting and investigations loomed, the director of the CIA at the time, Richard Helms, ordered the destruction of the MKUltra files. Sidney Gottlieb carried out the order, and a large quantity of records was deliberately destroyed. This act of destruction means that a complete accounting of the program is simply impossible. We will never know the full scope of what was done, because much of the evidence was intentionally erased. And yet, not everything was lost. By a strange accident, a cache of financial records related to the program had been stored separately, misfiled in a different location, and so it survived the destruction order. Years later, in 1977, these surviving documents, amounting to thousands of pages, were located through a request under the Freedom of Information Act, the law that allows citizens to seek access to government records. These recovered files, along with the testimony gathered in congressional investigations, form the basis of almost everything that is reliably known about MKUltra today. Here it is worth being especially honest. Because so many records were destroyed, and because the surviving picture is incomplete, MKUltra has become a magnet for wild speculation. Over the years, it has been blamed for all manner of dramatic and sinister outcomes, many of which have no real support in the evidence. It is important to separate what the documents actually show from what popular culture has imagined. The documented reality is a story of unethical experimentation, of people harmed without their consent, of poor oversight and reckless disregard for human dignity. That is bad enough. It does not need to be inflated into something even larger to be genuinely disturbing. There is also a quieter truth worth mentioning. According to the later testimony of Sidney Gottlieb himself, the man who ran the program, the whole effort was, in his own assessment, largely a failure. He suggested that when everything was weighed, the money spent, the effort expended, the risks taken, the program had probably not been worth it,
and had not yielded the powerful capabilities its planners had hoped to find. The dream of controlling the human mind, it seems, remained just that, a dream, even after all the harm done in its pursuit.
MK Ultra, in the end, is a story about fear leading good institutions to do terrible things. It is a reminder that secrecy can corrode ethics, that the absence of oversight can allow serious abuses to continue for years. And it is one of the reasons that when the full range of the agency's activities eventually came to light, the public reaction was so intense. But before we reach that reckoning, we should turn to a part of intelligence work that is often the most personal and the most fraught of all, the world of human spies, defectors, and double agents. Chapter 11. Spies, Defectors, and Double Agents. For all the tunnels and aircraft and satellites, the oldest form of intelligence work remains the human one. It comes down to people, to a person with access to secrets and a decision about whether to share them, to the officer who must judge whether a source is telling the truth, to the defector who leaves everything behind, and the double agent who lives a life of quiet, constant deception. This human dimension of intelligence is the most intimate and often the most agonizing part of the entire craft.
Consider the situation of a defector, someone who abandons their own country and offers their services and knowledge to the other side. A defector from the Soviet Union arriving in the West could be an extraordinary source of information, bringing details about Soviet capabilities, personnel, and operations. But a defector also posed a terrible puzzle. Was he genuine, a true believer who had turned against his own government? Or was he a plant, sent deliberately by his own service to feed false information, to sow confusion, or to identify and mislead his hosts? Every defector had to be evaluated with intense suspicion, and the question of whether to trust him could consume years of effort.
This problem of trust lay at the heart of counterintelligence, the branch of the craft devoted to protecting one's own secrets and hunting for enemy penetration. For many years, the CIA's counterintelligence effort was led by a famously secretive and intense officer named James Angleton. Angleton became convinced that the Soviet intelligence services were extraordinarily cunning and that they might have penetrated Western agencies at the highest levels. His hunt for hidden traitors, his mistrust of defectors, and his elaborate theories about Soviet deception became legendary. But his suspicions could also become corrosive. In his relentless search for moles, careers were damaged, and the agency was at times nearly paralyzed by doubt. The question of how much suspicion is healthy and how much becomes destructive has no simple answer, and Angleton's long tenure remains a subject of debate.
On the other side of this coin were the Western sources inside the Soviet system, the men and women who secretly worked for the West while living behind the Iron Curtain. Their courage is difficult to overstate, because discovery meant almost certain death. One of the most valuable of these sources in the early 1960s was a Soviet military intelligence officer named Oleg Penkovsky. Working with British and American intelligence, Penkovsky passed a wealth of information about Soviet military capabilities. His reporting was regarded as extremely valuable, particularly during the tense years of the early 1960s. But his secret life did not last. He was discovered by Soviet authorities, arrested, and executed. His fate was a stark reminder of the stakes involved for those who chose to spy against their own governments. And then there was the reverse, the nightmare that haunted every intelligence service, the traitor within. We have already met one such figure, George Blake, the British officer who betrayed the Berlin Tunnel and much else to the Soviet Union. Blake was not alone. Over the decades of the Cold War, both sides suffered from the betrayals of their own people. Individuals who, for reasons of ideology, money, resentment, or some tangled mix of all three, chose to sell their secrets to the enemy.
These betrayals could be devastating. A single well-placed traitor could unravel years of careful work, expose networks of agents, and send loyal sources to their deaths. The damage was not only practical, but psychological. Once a service knew it had been penetrated, but did not yet know by whom, a kind of poison spread through it. Everyone became a possible suspect. Trust, the essential currency of intelligence work, drained away. The hunt for a hidden traitor could tear an organization apart from the inside, even before the traitor was found. The human side of intelligence, then, is a world of profound moral and emotional complexity. It asks people to lie for a living, to befriend others in order to betray them, to live double lives, and to make judgments about loyalty and truth that carry life and death consequences. It rewards suspicion, and yet suspicion carried too far becomes its own kind of madness. It depends on trust, and yet it can never fully trust anyone.
This is perhaps why the stories of individual spies and defectors have always fascinated us more than the technical operations. A tunnel or a satellite is impressive, but a person choosing in secret to betray their country or to risk everything for a cause touches something deeper. These were human beings making some of the hardest choices imaginable, often in isolation, knowing that a single mistake could cost them their lives. Their stories remind us that behind every intelligence operation, however grand or technical, there are individual people, with all their courage, weakness, and contradiction. We will return to this shadowed human world later, when we come to one of the most damaging traitors in the agency's own history. But first, let us turn to one of the most extraordinary technical operations ever attempted, an effort so ambitious that it seems almost unbelievable, an attempt to raise a sunken Soviet submarine from the floor of the deep Pacific Ocean. Chapter 12. Raising a Soviet Submarine. Some intelligence operations are quiet and subtle. This one was enormous, audacious, and almost impossibly ambitious. It is the story of how the CIA tried to lift a lost Soviet submarine from the bottom of the sea, 3 miles down, in total secrecy, in the middle of the Cold War. The operation was called Project Azorian, and it deserves to be told slowly, because it is a genuine mystery and one of the strangest engineering feats ever attempted.
The story begins in 1968, when a Soviet submarine known as the K-129 sank in the Pacific Ocean. This was a ballistic missile submarine, meaning it carried nuclear-armed missiles, and it went down far out at sea, roughly 1,500 nautical miles northwest of the Hawaiian Islands. The Soviets searched for their lost vessel, but were unable to find it. The United States, however, using its underwater listening and detection capabilities, was able to locate the wreck with far greater precision. And so the Americans knew something the Soviets did not. They knew approximately where the K-129 lay. For American intelligence, this presented an extraordinary temptation. A Soviet ballistic missile submarine would be a treasure trove of secrets. Its nuclear warheads, its missiles, its codebooks and cryptographic equipment, its sonar and other systems, all of these could reveal a great deal about Soviet military technology and capabilities. If the United States could somehow recover the submarine or a significant part of it, the intelligence value might be immense. But the obstacles were staggering. The K-129 lay at a depth of roughly 16,500 feet. That is more than 3 miles straight down in the crushing darkness and pressure of the deep ocean. No one had ever attempted to raise anything so large from such a depth. The engineering challenge was, by the standards of the time, at the very edge of what seemed possible, and perhaps beyond it. Some compared the difficulty of the undertaking to the great technological feats of the space program. The solution the CIA pursued was breathtaking in its scale. The plan was to build an enormous purpose-designed ship capable of lowering a gigantic mechanical claw all the way to the ocean floor, grasping the submarine and slowly hauling it up into a great chamber within the ship's hull. To do this, the vessel would need a massive opening in its bottom, a kind of interior harbour into which the recovered submarine could be lifted, hidden from view. Of course, building such a strange and gigantic ship and sailing it out to a specific spot in the Pacific to hover for weeks would attract enormous attention. The Soviets would surely notice and would want to know what the Americans were doing. So the operation needed a cover story, a plausible explanation for why this remarkable ship existed and what it was doing out at sea.
The cover story chosen was ingenious. The CIA enlisted the eccentric and reclusive billionaire industrialist Howard Hughes, a man famous for his wealth, his aviation ventures, and his mysterious private life. The idea was to present the ship as a Hughes project built for the purpose of mining valuable metals from the deep ocean floor. At the time, the idea of harvesting mineral-rich nodules from the seabed was a genuinely discussed, if speculative, commercial venture. By attaching the project to Hughes and to deep-sea mining, the CIA gave the whole operation a believable public face. The ship was named the Hughes Glomar Explorer, and to the outside world it was simply a bold commercial experiment in ocean mining. The construction of the ship and its recovery systems took years and cost an enormous sum, much of it hidden within secret budgets. And then, in the summer of 1974, the Glomar Explorer sailed out to the recovery site and began the astonishing work of lowering its claw toward the wreck of the K-129, far below.
To grasp the strangeness of the moment, it helps to imagine the scene out on that remote patch of ocean. The Glomar Explorer, a vessel unlike anything else afloat, sat far from any land, hundreds of miles from the nearest shore, holding its position above the wreck. Deep within its hull, a great system of pipe and machinery began the slow work of lowering the recovery apparatus down through the water, section by section, hour after hour, mile after mile, into a darkness so complete and a pressure so immense that no human could ever have gone there. The crew worked in shifts around the clock, aware that they were attempting something no one had ever done, and that the smallest failure of a valve or a cable at that depth could doom the entire effort.
The operation was carried out under great tension, with Soviet vessels sometimes present in the area, watching the strange American ship without knowing its true purpose. At one point, a Soviet vessel lingered nearby, its crew observing the odd American ship with evident curiosity, perhaps suspicion, but apparently never grasping what was truly happening beneath the waves. The Americans continued their delicate work, carrying on as though they were indeed a commercial mining venture going about its business, while 3 miles below them a mechanical claw closed slowly around the remains of a lost submarine. The recovery itself was slow and painstaking. It took weeks of careful work. The great claw descended into the depths, closed around a portion of the submarine, and began the long, delicate process of lifting it toward the surface. And here the story reaches its bittersweet climax. During the lift, as the recovered section was being hauled upward through the miles of water, part of the submarine broke apart and fell back into the deep. The Glomar Explorer succeeded in raising a portion of the K-129,
but not the entire vessel. Exactly how much was recovered and precisely what intelligence value it held remains to this day partly classified. The CIA has never fully revealed what was learned from the operation. When the declassified account of the project was finally released decades later, key details were still redacted, leaving the ultimate success of the mission a matter of continued uncertainty.
What is known is deeply human and somber. Among the wreckage recovered were the remains of several Soviet sailors who had died when the submarine sank. The Americans gave these men a formal burial at sea, conducting a respectful ceremony for the fallen crew of an enemy vessel. Years later, after the Cold War had ended, a director of the CIA presented the Russian government with footage of this burial, a quiet gesture of respect across the old divide. There is one more legacy of Project Azorian, and it is a curious one that has outlived the operation itself. When word of the strange ship and its true purpose began to leak to the press in the mid-1970s, journalists sought official information about it. In response to one such request, the government adopted a careful formula, refusing to confirm or deny that any such records or activities existed. This response, born from the secrecy surrounding the Glomar Explorer, gave rise to a phrase that entered the language of government secrecy. To this day, when an agency refuses to acknowledge whether it even possesses information on a subject, this careful non-answer is sometimes called a Glomar response, named after the ship that tried to raise a submarine from the bottom of the sea. It is a fitting legacy for an operation that was itself an exercise in maintaining, and eventually only partially lifting, a veil of secrecy. Project Azorian stands as one of the boldest technical undertakings in intelligence history. A mission almost guaranteed to fail, attempted anyway, and kept secret for years. It captures something essential about this whole story, the way ambition, ingenuity, secrecy, and uncertainty all wound together in the intelligence work of the Cold War. But by the mid-1970s, the era of unquestioned secrecy was coming to an end. The country was about to start asking hard questions about what its intelligence agencies had been doing all those years in the dark. Chapter 13. Washington begins asking questions. For most of the first 3 decades of its existence, the CIA operated with remarkably little outside scrutiny. Congress, for the most part, did not look too closely at what the agency did. There was a kind of unspoken understanding that intelligence work was necessary, that it had to be secret, and that it was best not to ask too many questions. One senator later summed up the old attitude by remarking that the committee meant to watch the agency had never really watched at all. But in the early and mid-1970s, this comfortable arrangement collapsed. Several forces came together to shatter the wall of silence. The country had been through the long agony of the Vietnam War, which had eroded trust in the government's honesty. It had endured the scandal known as Watergate, which drove a president from office and revealed abuses of power at the highest levels. The public mood had shifted from deference to suspicion. Americans were newly willing to believe that their government might be hiding serious wrongdoing, and newly determined to find out. Into this atmosphere came a series of revelations. Internally, the CIA itself had already compiled a list of activities that might be illegal or improper, a collection of its own institutional secrets that came to be known informally as the family jewels. This document had been assembled at the direction of agency leadership, gathering together accounts of questionable actions from the agency's past. For a time, it remained secret, but the pressures of the era were building.
The decisive spark came at the end of 1974, when a prominent investigative journalist published a report alleging that the CIA had been conducting illegal surveillance of American citizens, spying on the anti-war movement and other domestic groups, in violation of its charter, which was supposed to restrict it to foreign intelligence. This report caused an uproar. If true, it meant the agency had turned its tools inward against the very people it was meant to serve.
It is worth understanding the significance of that charge. When the CIA had been created, back in 1947, its founding law had been careful to state that the agency would have no police or internal security powers within the United States. The whole point was to reassure a public wary of secret police that this new organization would look outward, toward foreign threats, and would not become an instrument of surveillance against American citizens at home. The allegation that the agency had, in fact, been spying on domestic political movements struck directly at that founding promise. It suggested that a line meant to be sacred had been crossed, and it fed a growing fear that the tools of secret power, once created, would inevitably be turned inward unless someone stopped them. In response, the United States Senate established a special committee in early 1975 to investigate the intelligence agencies. It was formally called the Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, but it is remembered by the name of its chairman, Senator Frank Church. It became known simply as the Church Committee. A parallel investigation was launched in the House of Representatives, and the President established his own commission as well. But it was the Church Committee whose work would prove most sweeping and most lasting.
Over many months, the Church Committee dug into the secret history of the CIA and also of other agencies, including the FBI and the National Security Agency. What it uncovered was, by any measure, extraordinary. The committee documented a wide range of activities that had never been meant to see daylight. It found that the agency had been involved in plots to assassinate foreign leaders. The committee's report detailed schemes aimed at figures in several countries, including the long-running efforts against Fidel Castro of Cuba and involvement in plots touching leaders in the Congo, the Dominican Republic, and elsewhere. Some of these plots had never come to fruition. Some had involved bizarre and disturbing methods. But the simple fact that the government of the United States had contemplated and in some cases attempted the murder of foreign leaders was profoundly shocking to the public. The committee also brought the MK Ultra experiments into the light, revealing the drug testing on unwitting subjects and the destruction of the program's records. It exposed programs of domestic surveillance, including the opening of citizens' mail and the interception of communications. It documented the FBI's campaigns against domestic political groups and figures. Piece by piece, it assembled a portrait of intelligence agencies that had, in significant ways, operated beyond the reach of law and oversight, sometimes against the rights of American citizens themselves.
The investigation was not without controversy, even at the time. Some argued that airing these secrets damaged national security and harmed the country's ability to conduct necessary intelligence work. There were genuine tensions between the public's right to know and the real need for some secrecy in matters of national defense. The president of the time worried openly that publishing certain findings, particularly regarding assassination plots, would do grave harm to the nation's standing in the world. These were not simple questions, and reasonable people disagreed about where to draw the line. But the overall effect of the Church Committee and the related investigations was a lasting transformation in how the United States governed its secret agencies. Out of this reckoning came real reforms.
Permanent committees were established in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, specifically charged with overseeing intelligence activities on an ongoing basis. No longer would the agencies operate with almost no legislative supervision. The President issued an order banning political assassination, a prohibition that has been maintained in various forms ever since. And in the years that followed, new laws were passed to regulate certain kinds of surveillance and to require greater accountability. The reckoning of the 1970s also shed light on operations that had until then remained obscure. It was in this period, for example, that the public learned more about the agency's activities in Chile, in South America, during the early 1970s. This is a subject that must be handled carefully because it is genuinely complex and still debated among historians. In Chile, a leftist politician named Salvador Allende won the presidency in 1970. The American administration of the time, deeply hostile to the idea of a Marxist government in South America, sought to prevent Allende from taking office and, failing that, to undermine him. Documents later revealed that the president had directed the CIA to work against Allende and that the agency pursued efforts to encourage a military coup and to create economic and political pressure. One especially dark episode involved a scheme to kidnap a senior Chilean general who was a firm believer that the military should stay out of politics. The general was killed during a botched abduction attempt, an outcome that the agency's own records indicate had not been the intended result, but which flowed from the reckless effort to remove an obstacle.
Allende did take office and governed for nearly 3 years. Then, in September of 1973, he was overthrown in a military coup, and a long and brutal dictatorship under General Augusto Pinochet followed. The precise role of the United States in the 1973 coup itself has been the subject of intense debate. On one side, some historians argue that years of American covert action, including funding for opposition groups and media and sustained efforts to destabilize Allende's government, helped create the conditions in which the coup became possible. On the other side, later assessments, including one by the CIA itself, concluded that while the United States had sought to undermine Allende and had, in a sense, appeared to welcome his fall, there was no clear evidence that the agency directly organized or carried out the 1973 coup, which was ultimately the work of the Chilean military. The truth likely involves both realities at once: a sustained campaign of hostility and interference that shaped the environment, and a coup that was, in its execution, a Chilean affair. What is clear is that the Chilean people were not passive pieces on a board. They had their own deep divisions, their own political struggles, and their own agency in the events that unfolded. The story cannot honestly be reduced to a simple tale of a foreign power pulling every string. The investigations of the 1970s did not end intelligence work, nor were they meant to. Secret intelligence remained a necessary part of the nation's defense, but they marked a turning point. The idea that the agencies could operate entirely in the dark, accountable to no one, was over. From now on, at least in principle, there would be oversight, rules, and limits. Whether those limits would always hold, and whether they would keep pace with new challenges, was a question for the future. And the future, as always, was already arriving, in the final tense decades of the Cold War. The intelligence work of these years combined the old and the new. The classic tasks remained. Analysts still labored to understand the Soviet Union, to gauge its military strength, its economic health, and its intentions. Case officers still tried to recruit and run human sources inside hostile governments. Counterintelligence officers still hunted for traitors. And the technical collection systems, the satellites and the signals intelligence, had grown vastly more sophisticated than the early days of the U-2 and the first fragile Corona film capsules. Satellite reconnaissance, in particular, had matured into a capability of extraordinary power. From orbit, the United States could now monitor military installations, track the movement of forces, and count weapons, all without risking a single pilot or violating anyone's airspace. This constant, silent watching from above had a stabilizing effect that is easy to overlook. Because each side could observe the other, it became harder to conceal a sudden military build-up or to prepare a surprise attack unnoticed. In this way, reconnaissance technology, born in secrecy, quietly contributed to the strange stability that kept the Cold War from turning hot. At the same time, the human contest continued in its endless, shadowy way. The 1980s saw a series of espionage cases that reminded everyone how vulnerable even the most powerful services could be to betrayal from within. On both sides, there were individuals who chose to sell their secrets, and the consequences could be severe. We will come to one of the most damaging of these cases shortly, because its full impact was felt as the Cold War drew to a close. The broader strategic picture in these years was one of renewed confrontation, followed by unexpected transformation. In the early 1980s, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union rose again. There were dangerous moments, periods of deep mutual suspicion, when the risk of miscalculation felt frighteningly real. Intelligence played a crucial role in these years, sometimes calming fears with accurate assessment, sometimes, unfortunately, feeding anxiety when the picture was unclear. But beneath the surface, the Soviet Union was changing and struggling. Its economy was stagnating. Its system was rigid and increasingly unable to keep pace with the West. When a new and reform-minded leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in the mid-1980s, he began to loosen the tight controls that had defined the Soviet state and to seek a reduction in tensions with the West. For intelligence analysts, the great question of these years was how to read these changes. Was the Soviet Union genuinely transforming or merely maneuvering? Where was all of this leading? These were among the hardest analytical problems the agency ever faced, and honest observers acknowledged that the speed and completeness of what was coming took nearly everyone by surprise. This is a humbling truth about intelligence work, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. For all the resources poured into understanding the Soviet Union, for all the satellites and sources and decades of careful study, the ultimate collapse of the adversary was not clearly foreseen. Some analysts had detected the deep weaknesses in the Soviet system and had noted the growing strains. But the sheer rapidity of the unraveling, the way the whole vast structure came apart in just a few years, caught the world off guard. It is a reminder that even the most sophisticated intelligence has limits, that human societies can change in ways that resist prediction, and that the future, however carefully studied, retains its capacity to surprise. The great value of intelligence lies not in perfect foresight, which is impossible, but in reducing uncertainty, in helping decision-makers see a little more clearly than they otherwise would. That is a genuine and important service, but it is not the same as knowing what is to come, and the wisest practitioners have always understood the difference. It was in this shifting landscape, with the old certainties beginning to dissolve, that one of the last great covert campaigns of the Cold War was fought, not against the Soviet Union directly, but in a rugged and distant country that the Soviets had invaded, and where they would find themselves trapped in a long and draining war. That country was Afghanistan. Chapter 15. Afghanistan. At the very end of the 1970s, the Cold War took a dramatic turn in Central Asia. In December of 1979, the Soviet Union sent its army into Afghanistan, a mountainous, largely rural country on its southern border. The Soviets intervened to support a struggling communist government there, a government facing widespread resistance from a population that largely rejected it. What the Soviet leaders expected to be a manageable operation would become a long, bloody, and ultimately disastrous war, one that some would later compare to America's own painful experience in Vietnam. For the United States, the Soviet invasion presented both a danger and an opportunity. On one hand, it seemed to confirm fears of Soviet expansion, raising alarm about Moscow's reach toward the vital oil-rich regions further south. On the other hand, it offered a chance to impose a heavy cost on the Soviet Union, to bleed it, as some strategists put it, by supporting the Afghan fighters who were resisting the occupation. These fighters, drawn from many different groups and factions, were known collectively as the Mujahideen.
The American response became one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in the history of the CIA. It was given the code name Operation Cyclone. It actually began in a modest form shortly before the full Soviet invasion, with a small program of support authorized by President Jimmy Carter in the middle of 1979. After the Soviets poured in their forces at the end of that year, the effort expanded dramatically. The essential structure of Operation Cyclone was that the CIA supplied money and weapons, but it did not, for the most part, deal directly with the Afghan fighters on the ground. Instead, the support flowed through the intelligence service of neighboring Pakistan, which managed the distribution of aid to the various resistance groups. This arrangement had advantages and consequences. It gave the operation a layer of deniability and relied on local knowledge. But it also meant that Pakistan, and particularly its intelligence service, had enormous influence over which factions received the most support. The aid tended to flow towards certain groups, often the more religiously militant ones, favored by the Pakistani authorities.
The scale of the operation grew enormously over the years. In its early days, the funding was measured in tens of millions of dollars per year. By the peak of the effort, in the late 1980s, it had risen to hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and the total cost over the life of the program ran into the billions. This aid, often matched by contributions from other countries, funded a vast flow of weapons and supplies to the resistance. In the early years, the weapons provided were deliberately modest and often of older or non-American origin to preserve deniability and avoid a direct, visible American hand. But as the war ground on, the support became more sophisticated. The single most famous and most consequential weapon supplied to the Mujahideen was a portable anti-aircraft missile known as the Stinger. Introduced in significant numbers beginning around 1986, the Stinger allowed lightly armed fighters on the ground to shoot down Soviet aircraft and helicopters, which had until then dominated the skies and terrorized the resistance. The arrival of these missiles is widely credited with shifting the balance of the war, making it far more costly for the Soviets to operate their air power.
For the Afghan fighters themselves, the war was a grinding ordeal, fought in some of the harshest terrain on earth, among barren mountains and scorching valleys, against a modern army equipped with tanks, aircraft, and overwhelming firepower. They relied on knowledge of the land, on endurance, and on a fierce determination to expel the foreign occupier. Whole villages were destroyed. Millions of Afghans fled their homes, pouring across the border into vast refugee camps in Pakistan, where they lived in difficult conditions for years. The suffering of ordinary Afghan civilians during this decade was immense, and it is a part of the story that can be lost when the focus falls only on weapons and strategy and the contest between great powers. Behind the covert program and the geopolitical calculations lay a real war, with real human cost, borne mostly by the people whose country had become the battlefield.
Slowly, the war became unbearable for the Soviet Union. The human cost mounted, with many thousands of Soviet soldiers killed and many more wounded. The financial burden grew heavier, and at home the war became increasingly unpopular. Under Gorbachev, the Soviet leadership eventually decided to cut its losses. In February of 1989, the last Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan, crossing back over the border and leaving behind a country ravaged by a decade of war. For the United States and its partners, the withdrawal was seen as a major victory, a demonstration that the Soviet Union could be defeated, or at least exhausted, even in a conflict on its own doorstep. But the story of Afghanistan did not end happily, and this is where careful honesty is essential. The withdrawal of the Soviets did not bring peace. Instead, the various Afghan factions, now heavily armed and no longer united by a common enemy, turned on one another. The country descended into a brutal civil war, and out of that chaos would eventually emerge new movements and new conflicts, some of which would have grave consequences in the decades to come, including for the United States itself.
There is a widespread and much debated claim that Operation Cyclone directly created the forces that would later turn against the West, that the United States, in effect, armed its future enemies. This is a subject where it is important to be precise and to avoid oversimplification. It is true that the war in Afghanistan drew in militant fighters from many countries, and that the broader environment of that conflict contributed to the rise of militant networks. It is also true that some of the weapons and training provided during that era later caused problems. But the direct lines that are sometimes drawn, suggesting that specific American programs deliberately created specific later enemies, are often exaggerated or oversimplified. The honest picture is one of complex, unintended and long-term consequences, in which a covert operation aimed at one goal helped shape a volatile landscape whose later developments no one fully anticipated or controlled. What can be said with confidence is that the Afghan war and the covert efforts surrounding it left a complicated and troubled legacy, one that would echo well beyond the end of the Cold War.
And the end of the Cold War was now remarkably at hand. Within months of the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the communist governments of Eastern Europe began to fall, one after another. The wall dividing Berlin, that city of tunnels and spies, was opened in late 1989, and within a couple more years, the Soviet Union itself, the great adversary that had defined the agency's entire existence, would dissolve. For an organization built to fight the Cold War, this was an earthquake. It raised a question that was almost existential. If the enemy was gone, what was the agency now for? The end of the Cold War brought a wave of hopeful expectations. Some spoke of a peace dividend, the idea that with the great rivalry finished, the world might grow safer and the enormous resources devoted to defense and intelligence might be reduced. There were serious discussions about what role intelligence agencies should play in a world without the Soviet threat. Budgets were questioned, missions were reconsidered. The agency faced a genuine crisis of purpose. But the notion that the age of spies was over proved to be an illusion. Even as the old confrontation ended, the work of intelligence continued, and new challenges were already emerging. And in a painful irony, it was precisely in these years, as the Cold War closed, that the agency was forced to confront one of the most damaging betrayals in its entire history, a wound that had been bleeding secretly for nearly a decade. The traitor's name was Aldrich Ames. Ames was not a defector or an outside agent. He was one of the agency's own, a career officer who had worked for the CIA for more than 30 years, specializing in Soviet matters, the very heart of the Cold War mission. And beginning in 1985, for reasons that came down largely to money and personal troubles, Ames began secretly selling the agency's most precious secrets to the Soviet Union and later to Russia.
The damage he caused was catastrophic. Ames had access to information about the agency's human sources inside the Soviet system, the men and women who were secretly working for the West at enormous personal risk. He betrayed them. He handed over their identities to Soviet intelligence, and the consequences were swift and deadly. A number of these sources were arrested, and at least 10 of them were executed. In a single, sustained act of treachery, Ames compromised a large portion of the agency's most important assets against its main adversary. By some accounts, he betrayed essentially the entire network of American human sources in the Soviet Union and Russia at the time. For years, Ames escaped detection. The agency knew something was terribly wrong, as source after source was rolled up and lost, but it could not identify the cause. Ames even passed lie detector tests during this period. He lived beyond his apparent means, buying an expensive house and a luxury car, spending sums that should have raised alarm, and yet for a long time no one connected these signs to the disaster unfolding around them. It was a failure not only of one man's loyalty, but of the systems meant to catch such betrayal.
Eventually, a patient mole hunt closed in. Investigators pieced together the financial evidence and the pattern of losses, and their suspicion settled on Ames. In February of 1994, he was arrested, along with his wife, who had assisted him. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison, where he remained for the rest of his days. Over the years of his betrayal, he had received millions of dollars from his handlers, making him, by the measure of money paid, one of the most highly compensated spies in the history of American intelligence.
The Ames case was a devastating blow, and it forced a period of painful reflection within the agency about how such a betrayal could have gone undetected for so long. It led to reforms in counterintelligence and security, tighter scrutiny of employees, and a renewed awareness that the greatest threats can come from within. It was also a sobering reminder that the human vulnerabilities at the heart of intelligence work do not disappear when a war ends. Ames was followed, a few years later, by the discovery of another damaging traitor, this time within the FBI, a man named Robert Hanssen, who had likewise spied for Moscow over a long period. Hanssen's case was in some ways even more chilling, because he was himself a counterintelligence officer, one of the very people entrusted with catching spies. For years, while ostensibly hunting for enemy penetration, he was himself among the most damaging penetrations imaginable, passing an enormous quantity of sensitive material to Soviet and then Russian intelligence. He too was eventually caught, arrested in the early years of the new century, and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison.
Together, these cases showed that the problem of the insider threat was deep and enduring. They demonstrated that no amount of technical brilliance or organizational strength could fully protect an intelligence service from the possibility that one of its own trusted members might choose to betray it. The vulnerability was human and therefore permanent. It could be reduced through better security, closer scrutiny, and more careful attention to warning signs, but it could never be eliminated entirely. As long as intelligence work depended on people, and it always would remain hostage to the choices those people made, in secret, about where their loyalties truly lay. Beyond the trauma of these betrayals, the 1990s were a decade of searching for the agency. The clear, if dangerous, focus of the Cold War had given way to a more scattered and uncertain set of concerns. There was the challenge of tracking the spread of dangerous weapons. There were regional conflicts and instability in various parts of the world. There was the growing problem of international terrorism, which was beginning to take new and more menacing forms. And there was the difficulty of maintaining and justifying a large intelligence establishment in a period when the old, obvious enemy no longer existed.
In hindsight, we can see that the 1990s were not really a lull at all, but a period in which new dangers were quietly gathering. The agency, along with the rest of the government, was trying to adjust to a transformed world, not always successfully, and not always quickly enough. Threats that seemed secondary at the time were growing in the shadows. And as the century turned, one of those threats would erupt with a violence that would reshape the agency and the country once again. Chapter 17. Intelligence in a New Century. As the 1990s drew to a close and a new century began, the shape of the danger facing the United States was changing. The great state adversary of the Cold War was gone. In its place, a more diffuse and elusive kind of threat was rising, that of international terrorism, carried out by networks that answered to no single government and operated across many borders. Within the intelligence community, some officers had been sounding the alarm about these threats for years. A specialized unit had been established in the mid-1990s to focus on a particular militant network and its leader, tracking their activities and warning of the growing danger they posed. Through the late 1990s, there were attacks against American targets abroad that made the threat increasingly concrete. Analysts and officers produced warnings, and there was a growing sense within parts of the intelligence world that a serious danger was building. But translating these warnings into action and connecting the fragments of information held by different agencies proved difficult, echoing, in a way, the very problem of scattered intelligence that had led to the agency's creation in the first place. That danger became horrifically real on the 11th of September 2001, when coordinated terrorist attacks struck the United States, killing thousands of people and shocking the world. The attacks were a catastrophe, and they were also, among many other things, an intelligence failure, in the sense that the government had not been able to detect and prevent the plot, despite various pieces of information that, viewed together, hinted at the gathering threat. In the aftermath, investigations examined how the warning signs had been missed and how the different agencies had failed to share and connect what they knew. The 11th of September transformed the intelligence community as profoundly as any event since its founding. Counterterrorism, which had been one concern among many, now became the overriding priority. Resources poured into the effort. The agency's focus shifted dramatically toward hunting terrorist networks, disrupting plots, and pursuing those responsible for the attacks. Intelligence work took on a new urgency and a new prominence, and the agency found itself at the very center of the nation's response. This new era also brought some of the most serious controversies in the agency's history, and they must be treated with honesty and care. In the years after the attacks, in the intense atmosphere of fear and determination, the government authorized programs and practices that would later become the subject of profound debate and, in many cases, condemnation. Among the most controversial was a program of secret detention and harsh interrogation of terrorism suspects. Methods were used that many people, including officials, experts, and eventually a major congressional investigation, would come to regard as torture and as both morally wrong and of questionable effectiveness. These practices provoked enormous controversy when they became known.
A lengthy investigation by a congressional committee, portions of which were eventually made public, examined the detention and interrogation program in detail and reached deeply critical conclusions about it, questioning both its ethics and its value. Others defended aspects of the program, arguing that it had been undertaken in good faith during a period of genuine danger, and disputing some of the findings. This remains a painful and contested chapter, and it is one where reasonable people, looking at the same events, have drawn very different conclusions. What is clear is that these programs raised the most serious questions about the limits that a democratic society should place on its intelligence agencies, even, and perhaps especially, in a time of fear. The new century also saw the continued growth of technical surveillance and data collection, on a scale that the pioneers of the U-2 and the early satellites could scarcely have imagined. Advances in computing and communications created both new opportunities and new dilemmas. The ability to collect vast amounts of information raised difficult questions about privacy, about the proper balance between security and liberty, and about oversight in an age of enormous technical capability. These debates, which intensified as the century went on, are in many ways the modern continuation of the very questions that the Church Committee had grappled with decades earlier. How much secret power should a free society grant to those who protect it? Who watches the watchers? And how do we hold accountable the parts of government that must, by their nature, operate out of sight? These questions do not have final answers. They are the permanent tensions of intelligence in a democracy, and each generation must wrestle with them anew in the context of its own dangers and its own technologies. The specific threats change, the fundamental dilemmas endure.
It is worth stepping back at this point to reflect on the long arc we have followed, from a general who believed his country needed a secret service, through the anxious early years of the Cold War, the coups and the tunnels and the flights at the edge of space, the failures and the reckonings, the great betrayals and the strange technical marvels, all the way to the transformed world of the new century. Across all of it runs a set of constants: the tension between secrecy and accountability, the human vulnerabilities of trust and betrayal, the gap between what operations intend and what they actually produce, and the sobering truth that actions taken in the shadows, for reasons that seemed compelling at the time, can cast very long shadows indeed, shaping the lives of people far away and echoing down through the years in ways their authors never foresaw. Conclusion: the secrets that remain. We have travelled a long way tonight, through decades of hidden history, following the threads of operations that were once among the most closely guarded secrets in the world. And as we come to the end, it is worth pausing to consider the strange nature of this whole subject, the peculiar way that intelligence history reaches us.
Think of how much of what we have discussed was at one time utterly secret. The overthrow of governments, the tunnel beneath Berlin, the flights of the U-2, the attempt to raise a submarine from the floor of the sea, the experiments conducted in the shadows. For years, sometimes for decades, these things were known only to a handful of people, sworn to silence, their evidence locked away in vaults, or in some cases deliberately destroyed. And yet, slowly, much of it has come into the light. Through investigations, through the patient work of historians, through laws that allow citizens to request government records, through the release of aging files whose secrets no longer seemed worth keeping. This is one of the quiet wonders of the historical record. Operations that were meant never to be revealed now sit in archives, available to anyone who cares to look. The internal history of a coup, written in secret, can now be read online. The account of a submarine recovery, once among the most sensitive secrets in the country, has been partly declassified.
What was hidden has, in large measure, become known.
And yet, not everything. This is the other, more haunting truth. For all that has been revealed, much remains in shadow. Some files are still classified, their contents withheld for reasons of security or sensitivity. Some records were destroyed, and the knowledge they held is gone forever, beyond any hope of recovery. Some questions can no longer be answered, because the people who knew the truth carried it with them to their graves, never having spoken of it to anyone. The story we can tell is real, and it is remarkable, but it is also incomplete. There are gaps we cannot fill, and there always will be. Our understanding, too, keeps changing. Every so often another file is released, another document surfaces, another participant finally chooses to speak. And when that happens, the picture shifts. Something we thought we understood turns out to be more complicated. A story that seems settled gains a new layer. This is the nature of intelligence history. It is never quite finished. It is always, in a sense, provisional, waiting for the next piece of evidence to emerge from the archives.
There is something to reflect on here, as the night grows late, about how history is actually made. We often imagine that the great events of the world happen in the open, in parliaments and public squares, in declarations and speeches, and much of it does. But a great deal of history is also shaped quietly, by decisions made in closed rooms, by actions taken in secret, by people whose names most of us will never know. A meeting in an ordinary building, a message sent across an ocean, a file marked secret and placed in a drawer. These small hidden moments can alter the course of nations and change the lives of people who never learn why their world shifted the way it did. The men and women whose stories we have followed were not, for the most part, the heroes or villains of legend. They were people doing difficult and often morally complicated work, under pressure, in fear, with imperfect information, making choices whose consequences they could not fully see. Some acted with courage and honor, some caused great harm. Many did both at different moments in the same career. They lived in a world of secrets, and they carried burdens that they could rarely share.
And so, as we close, return in your mind to where we began. The quiet building late at night, the rows of locked cabinets, the files, some thin, some thick, holding the records of things done in the dark. Most of the people who lived those stories are gone now. The world they knew has changed beyond recognition, but their secrets remain, some revealed, some still hidden, waiting patiently in the archives. There is a kind of peace in that thought. The great struggles that once seemed so urgent, the operations that once seemed so vital, have settled now into history, into pages that can be read in the calm light of the present. The tension has drained away. What is left is understanding, slowly gathered, endlessly incomplete, and quietly fascinating. Let the questions rest for tonight. The archives will keep their secrets a while longer. The files are not going anywhere. And whatever remains hidden will perhaps one day come to light in some future time for someone else to discover. But that is a story for another night. For now, let the low light of those quiet vaults fade gently into darkness, and let the long history of secrets settle into stillness. Rest well. If these calm journeys through history help quiet your mind and carry you towards sleep, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly bring you peace. And if you would like to help this peaceful history channel grow, your support means more than you know. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and the time on your clock. It is oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same slow walk through the past. Until next time, sleep deeply and rest easy.